I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. I am resolved to go to the Savior, leaving my sin and strife. He is the true one, he is the just one, he hath the words of life. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. So many of you seem so far away. If you would like to, Dr. Wilmington has never been known to bite, and if you'd like to move down a little closer, he's really better closer up. He's more fun. Thanks, Dr. Wilmington.
All right, you may be seated. Well, it didn't happen, did it? At least I survived Thursday. I hope you did too. That was when Friday, I guess it was Friday, the world was come to an end, according to poor old Harold Camping. You know, we really need to learn a lesson about this, about false prophets and everything. But in a sense, he wasn't a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon. Camping, as far as I know, he had some questions about the Trinity maybe, but he believed in the deity of Christ and hell and heaven, the Great Tribulation. Certainly believed in the inspiration of the Scriptures. But what he didn't understand the first law of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the science of rightly interpreting the Bible. And he approached the Bible with a liturgical instead of a literal way, allegorical way. And that means that allegorical way, you say that he believed that each verse in the Bible has a surface meaning and a hidden meaning. And you really have to discover what's behind the hidden meaning, behind the surface verse. Well, how do you do that? Well, you make up some kind of laws. And for example, in the book of Jeremiah, he got all this nonsense from the book of Jeremiah that the rapture would take place on May the 21st, and then the Great Tribulation 5 months later on October 21st. And he made up his own rules there. And it's so tragic. Now, when you interpret the Bible, there's only one message per verse. Now, sometimes we discuss and we try to figure out what that message is. But I don't always agree with John MacArthur, but he made a statement I think is tremendous years ago. He said, this lady came to him, she said, well, you know, I know what you teach, but this is what this verse means to me. And she really started giving him the right act. He said, just a minute, lady. He said, let me ask you a question. What would that verse mean if you'd never read it? See, she looked at it in a subjective way. Well, this verse means this to me. No, he said, really, and I don't want to hurt your feelings. He said, I don't care what this verse means to you any more than you should care what this verse means to me. We, though, should care what did the verse mean to the writer of that verse. In other words, we have to go back in the New Testament 2,000 years, and we have to try to put ourselves in the place of Peter and Paul and James and discover the best of our ability, what did those men mean at that time and that culture using that grammar in the context. And so if we do it that way, then every verse can be said to be taken literal. You say, well, there's certain verses that, no, every single verse in the Bible can be taken in a literal way. For example, Jesus said in John 10, I am the door of the sheep. Well, we take that literally, not letterism. There's wood and there's a door handle, etc., and a key. No, it means I am John the Apostle meant, when he wrote that, literally, I am the door, I am the entrance of the sheep, you see. And so, well, at any rate, that's because he didn't do it that way. He spent $100 million of God's money, and that's tragic, and someday the poor old guy will have to answer for that. Well, having said that, hopefully by this time you have received your notes. You picked them up as you came in, and we do have 8 charts for you tonight. We have the 4 charts. We missed one last week, and so then we put the 4 together again. So at the end of your brochures here, you have the charts on Ezekiel and the charts on Daniel. And so if you'll turn to the last 2 pages, that's the 4 charts on the book of Daniel, and we'll begin looking at this. Daniel, I've overviewed it this way: Daniel 1-3, Daniel 4-6, Daniel 7-9, Daniel 10-12. Now, I hope, dear God, please, that you have all those, okay? And so Daniel 1-3, we read about a commitment. We sing the song, I am resolved. This is resolve. And Daniel 1, resolve, and then a statue and a fiery furnace. That's Daniel 1-3. Next sheet, Daniel 4-6, a tree, a wall, and a den of lions. And then Daniel 7-9, 4 wild beasts, and the king of glory, or the king of heaven. And then the battle between a goat and a ram. Now, put your money on the goat. He's going to win, like you need to put your money on the Cardinals. Okay, all right. And then the 70 weeks of Daniel, that's Daniel 7-8-9. And then Daniel 10-12, a demon and an unanswered prayer. And then the greatest king up to this time, and the greatest king of all times. And we're not talking about the Lord Jesus. And finally, end times. And so those are the 4. We'll go back, and this will serve as a sort of an overview of the 12 chapters of one of the most important books in all the Bible. All right, having said that, let's turn to Daniel part 1, and we'll begin with the bottom line introduction. 3 pagan kings and a Jewish prime minister, a story of decrees, determination, dreams, and deliverance. And we said a number of times, I'll review it again, Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian king that captured and later on destroyed the city of Jerusalem about 6 centuries BC. And he came down, first of all, in 606, surrounded the city, put it to tribute, and took Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with about 10,000 other royal hostages, and he brought them into Babylon. And then 10 years later, he came back. The troops got restless, and he made a second trip. And this time, he took Ezekiel and his wife and thousands of others, and again into captivity. The third time in 586, no more nice guy. He came back at that time that Jerusalem was actually agreeing to join Egypt in revolting against Babylon, and he wouldn't tolerate that. So he destroyed the city, burned the temple, and took the last king of Judah, a fellow by the name of Zedekiah, and gouged his eyes out and put a ring in his nose and carried him into captivity. And so Daniel is going to spend most of his life in the land of Babylon. We do know that he grew up as a young man in the city of Jerusalem. How old he was when he was captured, we don't know. All right. He was himself, I'm still reading on page 1, ministered to by both of heaven's recorded archangels, Gabriel and Michael. He has more to say about the coming Antichrist than any other Old Testament writer. And one of his contemporaries, a fellow that he knew and he grew up with, Ezekiel, refers to the righteousness of Daniel, comparing him with Noah and Job, and the wisdom, his wisdom. And Jesus quoted Daniel during the Mount Olivet Discourse, and we will discuss that later. All right, and then go over to page 2 at the bottom of the page. Unique features. Daniel is the second of two Old Testament books written in Babylon. The other was Ezekiel. As far as we know, we know they wrote their books there. As far as we know, they lived out their lives and died and were buried in the land of Babylon. On page 3, it is the only Old Testament book using the word Messiah. And that's only found one time in the New Testament, also in the Gospel, two times in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, and then verse 4. The Messiah, the Anointed One. In fact, the second time was used by the woman in the well. And she said, I know that you are the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, she said, I know he'll be able to tell us all these things that you're telling me. And he said, I am the Messiah. And so, but in the Old Testament, it's only found in Daniel chapter 9. And then look at number 5 here. We'll skip over a few. Nowhere else in the Word of God do we find so much significant prophecy in such a small compass. Number 6, in the providence of God, significant new discoveries have been made during this century. That was actually the 20th century, that shed light on the various historical statements in the book of Daniel. And I took these from Dr. Whitcomb's Every Man's Bible Commentary, and he lists no less than 13 archaeological, historical facts that have been documented since, the last part, probably the first part of the 20th century here. You can read those for yourself. Number 7, very interesting. Sir Isaac Newton, the great scientist, the greatest scientist perhaps of all time, who discovered the law of gravity, wrote in his book, Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John, that's the book of Revelation, these words. Now, let me just say that he wrote a commentary on the book of Daniel. And it's so sad, as wonderful a man as he was, and we quote from him, we're not even sure he was saved. He did not believe in the Trinity. And that could have just been ignorance, and I'm not sure he rejected it. He perhaps didn't understand it. But as far as we know, he never made, at least I've never heard or read where he made a profession, but he certainly was a believer in the Bible. But at any rate, he writes these words about the book of Daniel in his commentary on Daniel. Quote, whoever rejects the prophecies of Daniel does as much as if he underdetermines the Christian religion, which, so to speak, is founded on Daniel's prophecies of Christ. End of quotes. A copy of this book, printed in 1773, and I think there are just a few in existence, became one of the most prized possessions in Thomas Jefferson's library. It now resides in the Library of Congress. Years ago, I think one of the books that I had a chance to see was this book here. And Dr. Criswell, W.A. Criswell, former pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas. I don't know what he would have thought about Pastor Jeffries, who's now pastor there, making the statement about concerning Rick and the two the Mormon and the Baptist. But at any rate, Dr. Criswell writes the following, and you can read this yourself here. But on the next page, page 4, these are very interesting words, top of page 4. Criswell continues to write here. Josephus, he was a Jewish historian that wrote about the Jewish wars in 70 A.D. And Josephus, throughout his histories, makes much of the book of Daniel. The Jewish historian was a contemporary of Paul and John. In about AD 80, Josephus wrote the story of his people. He was Jewish, and he writes about the Jewish wars and the destruction of Jerusalem. A story of his people from Abraham down to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. One of the most moving and beautiful narratives in all literature is the story of the sparing of the holy city by Alexander the Great during the latter's conquest of the Persian Empire. It is recounted in his Antiquity of the Jews book, the conquering Alexander during his siege of Tyre. We talked about that. Remember where Tyre was two cities, an island city and a coastal city. During the siege of Tyre, had made appeal to the Jews for provision for his army. Jada, the high priest, refused. He wouldn't give him anything, saying that he had sworn to be faithful to Darius the Persian king. This made Alexander furious. After his destruction of Tyre and after his destruction of Gaza, Alexander turned the wrath of his invincible army against Jerusalem. Jada, according to Josephus, Jada, the high priest, was terrified, but God told him in a dream how to save the city. Carrying out the instructions of the Lord, Jada dressed his priests in white. He himself put on his glorious garments with scarlet robe, a breastplate, and golden mitre. Followed by a procession of priests and people in the white, he went out to meet Alexander, singing the songs of Zion. The Macedonian was so overwhelmed, and especially so when Jada showed him Daniel 8 passages which foretold his coming and of his victories. In other words, Daniel predicted 200 years before it happened that the goat, and that was Alexander, would win over the ram, and that was Persia. The narrative continues saying Alexander was so overwhelmed here that he tried to worship Jada, and at any rate, he did spare the city. Chris concludes this way. Whatever we may believe about Josephus being the world's greatest liar, they said he was the first evangelist. He was constantly exaggerating. We don't know that, but yet he is one of the most significant historians of all time. The fact remains, namely that while Alexander destroyed every city in Syria friendly to Darius the Persian, yet he not only spared Jerusalem, but greatly favored it. Now that is a fact. Why? There must be a reason. It is Josephus who tells us the why and that why, the what and that why, included in the prophecies of Daniel. Not only that, but and then history tells us also that when Alexander was sort of the Pied Piper of his day, John F. Kennedy just had charisma oozing from his fingertips. And so he left and made his way to Egypt and founded the city of Alexandria. And he was accompanied, actually followed by several thousand young Jewish men and women. And they just, I don't know if their parents tried to stop him, but they followed him on down there. And then he founded the city of Jerusalem, of Alexandria. And then they grew up there, still remained pious Jews, but of course Alexander made Greek the language of the Middle East. And so several centuries later, it was discovered about 150 years later that many of these Jewish parents had a problem. They could not read, their grandkids could not read the Hebrew Scriptures. They believed the Hebrew Scriptures. They couldn't read it because they grew up in knowing only Greek. And so because of that may have led to a group of them, we're told, sending representatives to Jerusalem and saying that we want to translate the Bible from Hebrew into the Greek language. And that probably did happen there. So, but at any rate, there was an interesting play in here between relationship between Alexander and the city of Jerusalem. Number 9, the unusual feature of this book is that Daniel wrote the central passage, chapter 2 to 7, in the Arabic language. 10, Daniel may be compared to Joseph, for both men had the gift of interpreting dreams. 11, his book marks the third of 4 great periods of miracles in the Bible. The periods are in the time of Moses and Joshua, Elijah and Elisha, Daniel and Ezekiel, and then Christ and his disciples. Daniel's life may be characterized by purpose, prayer, and prophecy. In matters of prayer, Daniel offers the first of 3 great confessional prayers over the sins of Jerusalem, and he did that in Daniel 9, and later Ezra will do it in Ezra chapter 9, next page, and then Nehemiah will do it in Nehemiah chapter 1. And all 3 of those men begin by confessing their own sin. Lord, forgive us of our sin, our iniquity. We have turned our backs. And so charity begins at home, and confession begins at home also. Those 3 great prayers taking up 3 great chapters in the Bible. Key prophecies in Daniel would include the rise and fall of 4 great Gentile kingdoms, followed by the establishment of Christ's glorious kingdom. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the world-famous Battle of Arbela between the Greeks and the Persians, and its outcome some 225 years in advance. That's when Alexander defeated Darius. And then the most profound Old Testament prophecy concerning God's timetable, the 70 weeks of Daniel. The actual number of days between the rapture and the millennium, a total of 1,335 days. You don't read that anywhere else except in Daniel 11. And then the greatest number of fulfilled prophecies found in a single biblical chapter, Daniel 11. And I've checked various commentaries on this. Daniel 11 contains over 100 such predictions concerning historical events which have already transpired. And then 14, two important statues are described in the book of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar was associated with both. We read of one in chapter 2 and one in chapter 3. God was behind the first, Satan was behind the second. Same man who dreamed both, though. We're going to look at those pretty soon. Nebuchadnezzar. Number 15, the statue that Nebuchadnezzar built on the plain of Dura, that was outside of Babylon, near the Euphrates River, marked the second of 3 satanic attempts to unify the world through a false religious system. These are the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, the golden statue that he built in Daniel 3, and then those two are past, but there's a future, the Antichrist statue in Revelation 11. And finally, the book of Daniel records 2 of the Old Testament's greatest examples of divine preservation in times of terrible danger, in the fiery furnace and in a den of lions. The most dramatic feast in the Bible, that's in Daniel chapter 5. The only Old Testament description of the Father. Now, some would put a question mark here and say, does he really describe the Father in chapter 7? We'll look at that maybe, if not this week, 2 weeks from now, because I should tell you next week is Halloween. And so you can leave your masks at home. I am, and I don't know what the planning here, but I'll see you 2 weeks from tonight here. Yes, I think he sees the Father seated on the throne there. And it's the only, if it is the Father, and it's the only description of the Father that you'll find in the entire Bible, in the Old Testament at least, and until you come to Revelation chapter 4, and I think John the Apostle saw the same vision that Daniel did, and he describes him in a little different way, but at any rate, we'll look at that. And then more information on the future Antichrist than can be found in any other biblical book in chapter 7 and 8 and 9 and 11. Okay, so 80%, in fact, I think someone said 85% of all the information on the Antichrist in the Old Testament is found in the book of Daniel alone. And one of the 2 most pronounced types of the Antichrist in the Old Testament, Antiochus Epiphanes, and Haman, the Agavite, was the other one. And then the only biblical book mentioning both Gabriel and Michael, heaven's 2 5-star generals, heaven's 2 biggies, heaven's 2 archangels. And finally, a very practical lesson here, an explanation why our prayers may sometimes be hindered. And you'll be surprised, maybe you won't, on who hinders them. All right, a final page. There's so many parallels between Daniel and Revelation that the seminaries often include them in the same course, and ours also, Daniel/Revelation. And I have, 15, maybe 10 or 15 on page 6 here, how Daniel can be compared to Revelation in matters of prophecy. All right, titles for and types of Jesus. The second one here is probably the most important. He's the 4th man in the fire. Discuss that a little later. All right, now what I'm going to do next week, I'll give you 18 pages of, like you got in Ezekiel, of my overview, printed overview of each chapter. And today, though, we'll just take a few chapters, probably get up to chapter 4 or 5. And then 2 weeks from today, I'll come back and then give you these 18 sheets as I did with Ezekiel. And then we'll sort of summarize, we'll review what we've already hopefully learned tonight. And then you'll have them for your notes here. All right, Daniel chapter 1 opens up with Daniel being appointed to the king's hierarchy, or the king's cabinet. Nebuchadnezzar did something extremely brilliant. He was one of the greatest kings, I think, that ever lived, practical. When he would destroy a city, he'd carry, of course, the noble into captivity, and he did this for two reasons. Number one, it didn't always work, but to prevent maybe rebellion, because if mom and dad wanted to join a rebellion against the king, they said, wait a minute now, he's got our son and daughter there. But another reason, he made sure that he got the best of the crop, and then he trained them, these young people, and it doesn't say women, but I suppose men and women, and he appointed them into either his cabinet or into the official Babylonian government. And so he used the brains wherever he could find it. And that's one of the great, I think, successes of America. We've used, for the most part, brains wherever we could find them. And at any rate, but the king there decided that he hadn't even met Daniel, I don't think, that there was going to be a test, and I'll read this. Daniel and his three friends, along with other Hebrew youths, are selected by Nebuchadnezzar to prepare themselves for the life of political service. And then the king decides that he's going to give them a test, and Daniel determines not to defile himself with the king's food. I don't know why the king did this, but I think we do know why Daniel refused this test to eat of the king's food for an indeterminate period of time. First it was 10 days, then later on. He determined three factors may have entered his decision. The meat and wine had probably been sacrificed to false gods. And maybe this is Nebuchadnezzar's way of sort of enticing them into the worship of not worshiping Jehovah God, but worshiping the Babylonian gods. And the food may have been prohibited under Mosaic law, pork and other unclean animals. And he may previously have taken the Nazirite vow. We don't know this, but his life seems to indicate that he might have been a Nazirite, Daniel. Okay, and of course one of the laws of the Nazirite would not touch, among other things, wine. And Satan doubtless attempted to get Daniel to rationalize through various ways. He may have considered, hey, the king had ordered it, and therefore it was a law. To disobey might bring severe punishment. It would probably spoil all chances of advancement. While in Rome or Babylon, simply do as the natives do. He was a long way from home, and no one would ever know. And God had failed him anyway in permitting his capture. I'm sure all those thoughts went through his head, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Satan has a way of making temptation very practical. But as we sung the song tonight, I am resolved no longer to linger, and that's exactly what Daniel did. The recommendation of Daniel, he proposed a test suggesting a 10-day diet of only vegetables and water. At the end of this short time, his superintendent could compare Daniel and his friends with others who ate the king's food, rich food, and it turned out that they were many times stronger and smarter at the end of a 10-day period than the 3-year period than their superiors or their contemporaries. And then Daniel was appointed to a very important political position that he held most of his life. All right, now that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, we begin with the scene in the royal bedroom. And Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream. No, he hadn't had a dream, he's had a nightmare. And it just is driving him up the wall. What on earth was this all about? So he calls his entire cabinet members in, with the exception of 4, Daniel and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they're all hovered around the bed there, and he said, fellas, he said, I've had a doozy. And he said, here's what I want you to do. I've had a terrible nightmare. And he said, I want you, first of all, to tell me what I dreamed. And secondly, I want you to give me the interpretation, what I've dreamed. Well, I couldn't do that, of course. And so they're stalling for a time. They said, well, I'll tell you what, you're busy, we're busy, and you need get back to sleep. And so you tell us what you dreamed, and we'll come up with some crazy interpretation. No, he said, I know where you guys are going. He said, listen, I pay you $250,000 a year and bonuses and everything. You have to know the Aramaic to get that out of the text. And so you better tell me what I dreamed and then tell me what it meant, or you're toast, you're out of here. They couldn't do it. And they made this statement. They said, it's a very amazing statement. They said, you know, you're asking us to do something that no other king would ask his magicians and astrologers and astronomers to do, wise men to do. The answer to your question resides with the gods, and they don't dwell in human flesh. Well, that was 6 centuries before Christ. That was absolutely true. But 6 centuries later, a young virgin girl will give birth to her firstborn son, wrap him in swaddling clothes and lay him in a manger, and then that statement will be no longer true, because from that point on, not the gods, but God did and does still dwell in human, howbeit glorified flesh. And so that was it. So he imposed the death penalty on all of them, including Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't there, but they were going to die also. Well, Daniel heard about it, and guess what? He began to pray. I think I'd do that too. You know, I think we would spend some time in prayer. And God revealed what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed to Daniel. Some believe that he actually allowed Daniel to dream the same dream, but whatever, he revealed what that was. And so Daniel met with him, and he said, you know, I think I can help you here. He said, well, okay, you can help yourself too. You can still, drink your coffee tomorrow morning because you're going to die unless you tell me. He said, all right. He said, I'll begin by telling you what you dreamed, then I'll give you interpretation. Here's what you dreamed. You saw a statue, and it was not a jolly green giant, ho-ho statue. This was a Frankenstein monster, and you were terrified, and you looked up at the statue, and you felt like you were a little grasshopper, and it was horrible. But not only what you saw bothered you, but what you heard, because suddenly there was a grinding sound, and like a gigantic claw or a hand, and you saw it, invisible hand, it was gouging out a gigantic rock, perhaps as big as a house. And then that rock sort of hovered, like we'd say today, like a helicopter over the statue and bombs away. And the statue was smeared, the stone fell upon the statue. It crushed it, it turned it into powder, and the wind blew it away. And he said, oh, by the way, he said one final fact. He said that statue was made of 4 metals. He said the head was made of gold. The second part of the statue was made of silver. The third part of the statue was made of brass or bronze. The fourth part of the statue was made of iron and clay. And then that gigantic rock fell upon it and smashed it. And when he finished, no doubt there was silence in the Oval Office for a little bit, and the king said, how did you do that? That's exactly what I dreamed. He said, didn't I tell you? There is a king in heaven that reveals dreams. Now, friends, Daniel could have told him anything, and he would have believed it, because that's only 2% as important as the 98%, whatever. You tell him what he dreamed, and certainly you would know the interpretation. And he could have said this, and I'll say it because I'm a wise scholar, and I know North Carolinian and Virginian and several other languages, Pig Latin. So I'm going to say this in the Ugaritic language. He could have said, this is what it means. I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. That's what I thought it meant. Now what does it mean? No, he didn't say that. But what he did say is this. He said, this statue represents 4 world Gentile powers and their dealings with the nation Israel, even though we're in captivity. He said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. And he said, and someday another kingdom will take over, and this will be the Persians. And that's the silver part of the statue. By the way, all the archaeological artifacts that they've dug up, gold was number one in the Babylonian Empire, and silver in the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. And the third, and he doesn't name him by name, but he describes him later on, is the Greek Empire, and the fourth is the Roman Empire. And oh yes, I forgot to tell you, King, that gigantic rock that fell upon that statue, that represents the fifth, the final, and the finest of all the kingdoms of the world. That's the kingdom of the Messiah. And the Messiah will destroy world Gentile power. And it turns out to be at the Battle of Armageddon. Well, now that's the proper interpretation, as far as I know. Almost all evangelicals believe that. But if you accept that, you got a problem. Here's the problem. Nebuchadnezzar, no doubt, was a head of gold. And the Persians did take over in October of 539. In October the 19th, I think, 539, took over from the Babylonians. And then the third, and Alexander the Great whipped up on the Persians at the Battle of Arbela in 225 BC. And then in the days of Jesus, Rome took over the entire world. Okay, but here's the problem. Well, let me just say that Jesus was born during the Fourth World Empire power. And, you know, his parents, or his mother and stepfather, had to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem because Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, had decreed that there be a census there. He grew up under Roman dominion, and he worked his miracles, told his parables, and preached his sermons. But wait, here's the problem, though. Did Jesus destroy world Gentile power while he was alive? No. In fact, if memory serves me correctly, he himself was put to death on the order of a soldier representing the Fourth Empire, right? The centurion. So you see the problem. Okay, and there's several answers to it. Number one, Daniel didn't write it in the first place. That's what the liberals would say. Somebody made it up. Secondly, if he did write it, he was smoking pot. But he got 3 out of 4, and that'll get you in the probably Super Bowl anytime, but it won't get you in the prophetical Super Bowl. You got 4. You got to go 4 out of 4. Or thirdly, save those Eura, because Rome's going to rise again, the Fourth Empire. And during the days of the Fourth Roman Empire, then Armageddon will take place. Now, let me read something here. 2 20th century wars provided the necessary impetus for the reuniting of Europe, the core of the historical Roman Empire. And this is my good friend who writes some of these words, Mark Hitchcock. Of course, I am referring to World War I and World War II. For centuries, the nation of Europe had fought one another again and again. But in the aftermath of World War II, a dramatic change occurred. Instead of building up for the next great armed conflict, as they had done with depressing regularity for almost 1,600 years, 1,600 years, you have these constant fighting of Rome. And you could not possibly have a unified Roman Empire until the 20th century. Well, for almost 1,600 years, they decided almost unexpectedly to come together for a coalition of nations known as the Common Market. Think about it. For the first time in 1,600 years, the necessary preconditions for a reunited, revived Roman Empire, the second stage of the Roman Empire predicted by the prophet Daniel, were suddenly wrestled into place. Peaceful relations between the nations of Europe are a necessary prelude to the revival of the Roman Empire as prophesied by Daniel in the Bible. Their reunification began officially in June the 7th, 1957, with the Treaty of Rome. June the 7th, 1957 is second only in importance to May the 14th, 1948, the existence of Israel as a nation, because from this time on, he says, since then, one by one, gradually yet steadily, the nations of Europe have come together, and this entire revolutionary process has taken place in just the time he wrote, 45 years. In other words, it was from that point on, June the 7th, 1957, not one European nation has declared war and tried to destroy another nation. Now, this is what some theologians call the modern 20th century, 21st century Humpty Dumpty coming together. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But June the 7th, 1957, it's happened, and it's happening now. And I want to just take a couple of minutes here to talk about this. Right now, and this sort of works in with a problem that many Bible students have had, you know, well, what part does Russia play in the last days? And I think the scripture is replete with answers. What part does Egypt and Iraq and others, and then maybe some suggestion on the part of America. But what about this incredible, amazing phenomena of the as I say, incredible evidence of the increase of Islam from 40, 50 years ago? It was just a little speck, and now it's world news. In fact, many nations, France, they practically destroyed Paris and burning all these cards, and England and some of these European countries, there are far more mosques than they are Christian churches. Now, how does this work into prophecy? Well, there are several things we might talk about, but I think one of them is this. I was reading one of the statesmen in Europe, and he was lamenting the fact, and he said, unless we do something, he said, Islam will take over America. Will take over all of Europe. He said, what we need is another Charles Martel. Charles Martel, of course, was the Frenchman that defeated the Muslim hordes in 732 AD at the Battle of Tours. And it saved, back then, Islam, the Arabs, from taking over all of Europe. And so as perhaps after the rapture takes place, or maybe even before, maybe this new Charles Martel is on the scene right now. Not only is Europe having all kinds of economic problems, but even more with the Muslim threat, a Western leader from Europe will rise. And his platform will be, get behind me, support me, help me, and I'll make sure that Europe remains for the Europeans and not for the Muslims. I think that's a strong possibility. And then, of course, when he gets into power, he will make a peace treaty with Israel, etc. And so, but we do know this, that the Muslim nations do join, as last week we talked about Gog and Magog. If Gog and Magog is Russia, then they do join with Russia in attempting to defeat and destroy the city of Jerusalem and the nation Israel. So there's so many things that are coming to pass. But again, these two dates, we've often talked about May the 14th, 1948, but I want to leave this date with you today, June the 7th, 1957. The Treaty of Rome was officially signed, okay? And, well, that's chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, you have a fiery furnace. And I want to read some of this to you, and then for the sake of time, I'm just going to go. Nebuchadnezzar, there's a sort of a switch in tactics here. Nebuchadnezzar's reaction to the statue in Daniel chapter 2, when you come to Daniel chapter 3. And Daniel 3 opens up with the fact that out of a clear blue sky, supposedly, that Nebuchadnezzar builds this gigantic statue, 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, Now, whether it was solid gold or not, with gold being, what, $1,700 an ounce, it would probably be $1 quadrillion. Some believe it was probably overlaid with gold, but whatever, it was an impressive statue. And he decided to build that in the plain of Dura. Why did he do that? And most commentators pointed out, and you read it, you could probably come to the same conclusion. This guy had a real problem with pride, ego problem. He wanted to be the whole statue. I don't want to be more than just the head of gold. So he builds this, and then he, as Dr. J. Vernon McGee said, he has the band plays, and when the Babylonian beboppers, they begin to swing and do their thing, the little boogie, why everybody was, his cabinet members were to bow down and worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar had made. And he had a sort of a little friendly persuasion. If you didn't do it, I got this furnace, I'm going to heat it to 7 times more than, and you'll be thrown in the fire. That was the greatest, probably, invitation of all times. I've been in this one time, this guy was, a pastor was an evangelist was trying to get people to come forward. I want every man here that has a mother to come forward. Well, that's most of us, I guess, And, but turn or burn, come down or go up and come down to the altar or go up and smoke, one of the two. Well, everybody did their thing, of course, and some tattletales were watching that 3 young men did not do that, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Where was Daniel? He's probably off on a trip because he was prime minister. He's probably running around all over the Middle East. And so they didn't, the song said they wouldn't bend, they wouldn't bow, they wouldn't burn. So they refused to do that, and so they squealed on him, and so Nebuchadnezzar brought him in, said, look, he said, I don't want to kill you. He said, you got a weird God, a weird religion, but you're honest, and a good man's hard to find. And he said, I'm going to give you another chance. And we read these words. He says, if you'll fall down and worship at the sound of the music, and we'll bring the band back and give you another chance, then it'll be okay. But if you worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? And you talk about resolve. This is what these 3 young men said. They said, O king, Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful, we're not anxious to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto you, O king, we will not serve thy God, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. If it be so, but these 3 words, if, but if not. Years ago, I had the privilege of bringing at that time he was president of Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Donald Campbell here. And Dr. Campbell preached on this, but if not. And apparently he'd been watching some faith healers on television, and it was always God's will for that's prosperity theology, for every Christian to have abundant health and wealth. And he said, if I come down with cancer, or you come down with some terrible situation, he said, by all means, get people to pray, but God can deliver you. But he said, the faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had 26 centuries ago should be our faith tonight. Our God is able, but he can deliver us, but if not. I remember 6 months before he died, our beloved pastor, Dr. Falwell, I was in the hospital with viral pneumonia, and he was too. He was a lot sicker than I was, but he called me. Earl, and Jerry Falwell, he always had, I said, well, gee, I didn't have any idea, Earl, he said, now you got to take care of yourself. I said, look who's talking. So he said, I've asked God to give me another 15 years with option to renew. We've always heard him say that. And he said, I'm going to include you and Elmer and several others in also. Well, God could have spared his life. God could. But if not, and God determined to take him about a year later, you see. And so our hands, our times, as the psalmist said, are in thy hands. God is able, but if not, we will still obey him in life or in death. And of course, I have this here. The three youths were no doubt aware of the many excuses available to them for bowing down at this private meeting. For example, why not join the system? You can't fight City Hall. Oh, this is modern 21st century excuses. We'll cooperate with old Neb and then lead him to Christ. A living dog is better than a dead lion, better red than dead. He who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. And Daniel, our leader, is not here to make the right decision for us, etc. Well, they decided not to do this. And of course, I'll come back to this pretty soon. I have a couple more minutes here. They were thrown into the fire. And we know what happens. As I say, I'll finish this in a few minutes at the end of how chapter 3 ends. Now, chapter 4, this is as far as we'll get tonight, is one of the most interesting chapters in all the Bible. I think this could be, chapter 4, could be entitled Nebuchadnezzar's Track. We've had people come here, former dope addicts, etc., and murderers, and give glorious testimonies. And sometimes they've written tracts, how God delivered me from drugs. A personal testimony by John Smith, Bill Jones, whatever. And I think this is Nebuchadnezzar's tract, how I got saved. I think because of the language at the beginning of chapter 4 and end of chapter 4, that Nebuchadnezzar had a better testimony than most Baptist preachers do, or most Baptist deacons do today. And so I think he's writing this, here's how I got saved. And I'll read at the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great is his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Now, this is not typical Nebuchadnezzar talk. He's always, you do what I do, you tell me my dream, or you're out of here, I'll burn you up. He had no use for human beings, but now he says, peace. And he said, peace be multiplied unto you. Something has happened. But he says, in the next verse, I'm getting ahead of my story, still reading here. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house, and flourishing in my palace. And then he's had another dream, as he had in chapter 2. And so he calls in Daniel. He doesn't worry about the wise men. He calls in Daniel. And Daniel interprets the dream for him. And the dream was this. He saw this gigantic tree. And it was housing for protection for all the animals, etc. One of the glorious trees, probably on the entire forest there. But he said there was someone from, King James had a watcher, maybe some official from heaven, cut down the tree and right to the stump, but put an iron band around the stump. And sometimes they would do that, indicating that maybe the tree would someday grow back again. But for some reason, they cut it down. And he said, what does this mean? And Daniel, for an hour, didn't say anything. And he said, don't you know the meaning? He said, yes, I do, but I hate to tell you. And he says, this tree stood for a man, and that man was Nebuchadnezzar. And because of all the fame and etc. that gone in your kingdom, he said, and people have depended upon you, he said, God, your pride has made the King of Kings furious, and unless you repent, he's going to cut you down. And 1 year, and he begged Nebuchadnezzar, please repent now. And 1 year went by, and Nebuchadnezzar refused. And then, 12 months after the dream, the king was strolling in the roof of his royal palace in Babylon, and here's what he says. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of thy kingdom, of my kingdom, by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? And even while the king spake his proud words. The judgment of God fell from heaven, and he was driven from the palace. And he also told him, for 7 years, if you don't repent, for 7 years you will lose your mind and be as a wild man. But then you will come to your senses, and God will restore you to your previous glory. And that happened 12 months later. And there is a interesting historical confirmation of this. This Nebuchadnezzar, you don't read it in Babylonian because you're not going to talk about a king's insanity. But the king's insanity is corroborated by history. Josephus quotes from a Babylonian historian who mentions a strange malady suffered by the king. There's also the testimony of a Greek historian. And after 7 years, what happened who had the kingdom, I don't know after that, during that time, Nebuchadnezzar is restored. And here is his testimony. He said, upon restoration, he says, and at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that lives forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. The story of the most powerful, one of the most powerful kings in the Old Testament, I believe, and how he comes to a saving knowledge of Jehovah God, and I think we'll see him in heaven. Now, in closing, back to Daniel and the fiery furnace. You may have heard this, but every time I repeat it, I get a blessing. There were 3 men that went in the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar said, did not I throw 3 in? Yes. And yet, how is it I see 4? And the 4th is likened to literally the son of a god, the son of the gods. He didn't say, oh, there's Jesus down there. It was, but he said, there's a God down there. Okay, and then later they came out of the fire, these 3 men, with not even the smell of smoke on them. And so a little math here. 3 in the fire. He sees 4 in the fire. 3 came out of the fire. And of course the question is, what happened to the 4th man? And the answer is, he's still there, and he's waiting for you. At Easter time, we sing a beautiful song, I come to the garden alone, and the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear calling, falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. But the joy we know as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Well, that's wonderful, but that's a beautiful scene, and the flowers are blooming, and the birds are singing, and the grass is green, etc. That's fine. But when I really need him, I need him in the fire. I need him in the fire. And the 4th man is still there. And the song says that in the fire, I'm with you as I am in the garden. All right, we're going to stand and sing the final 2 stanzas, I guess, of that song. And next week, then we will get the remaining notes on the book of Daniel, and we'll find out who the Antichrist is, and we'll find out about the 70 weeks of Daniel. Let's all stand. Okay, John?
All right. We're going to repeat that final chorus when we come to that, so be ready. I am resolved to enter the kingdom, leaving the paths of sin. Friends may oppose me, foes may beset me, still I will enter in. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. I am resolved, and who will go with me? Come, friends, without delay. Taught by the Bible, led by the Spirit, we'll walk the heavenly way. hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. Again on the chorus. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to